All right. Yeah, I'm back. Set it at 30 frames per second. Let's see if everything doesn't blow up and it actually works. But I'm hoping it'll be a little bit smoother. I definitely could not sustain 60 frames. So I'm going to continue with this video from David Knight interviewing Joel Skousen about the coming war, nuclear apocalyptic war that appears to be we're getting closer to this, it appears, day to day here, with tensions between Russia and China. So I'm gonna finish probably most of this video. There's about another 10, 20, 15 minutes left. I'm just gonna try to finish it. So here we go.
Frank, in theological terms, I think they're all satanically induced and inspired.
Mm-hmm. Satan
promises all three of these predator centers that they're going to win. But only one's going to win, and I think it's going to be the Anglo-American globalist. But I think Russia, by the way, will be eliminated in World War III because I think the globalists in America will cut a deal with China to attack Russia's rear, eliminate Russia, and then it's the U.S. versus the new Cold War enemy would be China. But in any case, you see, China really has powerful motives to take over North and South, North America and Canada. They want living space. They've run out of arable land to grow food in China. It's mostly desert in China. And the speech of General Hao Qian in 2008, former defense minister of China, said, we want the land in North America and Canada. We need living space, and we are going to be ruthless. We're not going to be patsies like the Nazis. We are going to be ruthless in cleansing the land. So they intend. That's why they won't hit cities initially in this strike. They want to hit military targets so they can blackmail. They want to talk us into letting them control the New World Order, and the Russians, of course, I think will be eliminated. But the globalists at any point intend to have this euphoric, wonderful socialist society where they control it all. Each one of these globalist power centers intend to do that. Now, we know the Russians are incapable. They can't even run their own system. And the Chinese are having trouble running their own. The globalists are very sophisticated, though. They use Russia and China to break down other countries, and that's why we brought Mao Zedong to power in China. We brought Castro to power by undermining Batista. We brought the Sandinistas to power by undermining Somoza in Nicaragua. We use communism to break down the social order so the globalists can come in their milder form of socialism. You own it, but we control it, to replace the evils of communism. And that's why it's very sophisticated. Our government, runs a campaign against drugs, and yet they import drugs through the CIA. They run a campaign against terror, and yet they created ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
That's right.
And, they play both sides.
And now they're using Marxism to break down our society, and
yes,
to break
that's
it
right,
down from the
BLM and Antifa.
That's right.
It's not that these globalists are communists. They're using communists to break down and create havoc so they can come in and impose their solutions to the crisis, which will be a milder form of socialism, but control nevertheless.
And that's what we've seen with the medical tyranny as well. Fauci's saying, well, we do this from the inside, we do it with disruption, and we do it iteratively, gradually. They're working with everything that they're doing now in our society and the schools is to break down our existing culture, to break down reality. As you're talking about where this is headed with the transgender and stuff, I think they truly are trying to force everybody into essentially their little cells, where I think the ultimate removal from reality is not even the transgender stuff. That has a pedophile aspect to it. But I think the ultimate goal is to have everybody severed from reality, living in a virtual reality, looking for transhumanism, where they can reimagine themselves as whatever they want to be. I think that's one of the key ways they're going to control us. As a matter of fact, Harari at Davos has even said that. We're going to control people by games and by virtual reality, ultimately.
Well, this whole transhumanism, AI, and other type of high-tech society, as I said, I don't think that's going to happen. First of all, I don't believe in transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that man has a spirit, a God-given spirit. You cannot clone human beings without God providing a spirit, because this human body does not live if the spirit is withdrawn. That's what makes it operate. That's what controls. It's not just genetics. It's just not pure mechanism, as evolutionists would have us know.
Yeah, I had that discussion with Zoltan Esvan, with a transhumanist. I was talking about that earlier in the program. I said, so what are you? Are you going to be copying yourself? Are you going to be able to transfer yourself? What are you? Are you just the physical stuff? Are you just the memory banks? Or is there some other component, the soul, that is the essence that you really are?
Yeah. Well, they don't believe in the soul. They don't
That's right.
believe in God. And so they can, think that they can integrate computer chips and control the mind. I don't believe that can be done. I think the will of man is innate, and we come with innate characteristics because our soul, exists. As the Lord told Nehemiah, before you were born, I knew thee and ordained thee a prophet.
Yeah.
We had an existence before that as a soul, and that's why certain people are more prone to things of God, and other people, they couldn't care less. I think we developed a closeness to God before we came here, as opposed to other people. Anyway, that's a personal opinion. But all I'm just saying is that I think that there's a real possibility, David, that this war will be so horrific, and because of the lack of moral character and Satan raging in the hearts of men, I think the prophecies come true about evil fighting against evil, and the globalists not being able to control what they reap in this war. I mean, can you imagine a year without electricity in the United States, and all the pillaging and the rape and the murder and the stealing and the theft that will go on as people try to survive and other things? How does that heal itself? How do you forgive and forget about neighbors who pillaged, and destroyed things? I don't think society is going to knit together, except in rural, safe places where people, when they are driven out of the cities because of its collapse. The only reason, conservatives and Christians are in these big cities because that's where the jobs are.
Yeah.
But in an EMP strike, those jobs disappear. And I think people, if they're prepared, or even if they haven't, they're going to tend to go back to rural roots. And I think there'll be new conservative majorities. So my hope for the future is that the Lord will provide safe places for a remnant of people that, good people would tend to gravitate toward the roots. And I think even the globalist powers that be have to pay lip service, at least, to democracy. They have to pay lip service to majority rule. And if we have new conservative majorities in good rural areas, I think that's the potential of the future.
Let me unmute my mic. Also, a lot of these this woke generation, none of them are reproducing. You've got AOC and others saying, why would you reproduce in a world like this, blah, blah, blah. There's a climate crisis, and a lot of them are not going to reproduce. And the only Christians, people that are conservative, those are the ones that are having children. All these woke weirdos on Twitter or what have you, they're not reproducing. So they're just going to die out.
And ultimately,
You've talked about strategic relocation, and you've got a book about it, very
Yes.
excellent book about strategic relocation, and also about the secure home and how to secure your home. Let's give people a little bit of advice. Let's say that you're already outside of the city and you're in a rural area. With these things developing like this, what would be your first priority that you would advise people to start to work on, assuming that they're already out of the city and they're in a rural area? What would be your first priority?
well, first of all, you're going to have to get self-sufficient in your electricity because there's not going to be any electricity. And that means a combination of generators and solar is the best. To do an entire 100% solar system is very, very costly, over $100,000. But if you have a 15 kilowatt generator, a diesel generator is really the best in terms of long-term fuel storage. But whatever kind of generator you have with enough fuel storage, you can run it twice a day or even once a day and supplement the rest with solar power to run, your various electronics that survive an EMP. And by the way, they can survive an EMP if you make some minimal preparations.
Yeah, talk about that with solar panels and inverters and things like that you're going to need to have in a solar system. Talk about its vulnerability to an EMP.
Well, everything electronic is vulnerable to EMP if it has attached to any kind of long wires. They act as antennas and they pick up this electromagnetic radiation, race down the wire, and fry the electronics. Now, you can protect your house from the power line surge that comes with a detector like First Surge by Siemens Corporation. It is only about $350, and it goes on your panel at the top of your panel and protects any surge and shunts it to ground. But still, inside your house, all your wiring is picking up EMP, and so there are small individual EMP protectors. The cheapest ones are your little power strips. If you look at the label on the power strip, if it clamps down a surge in less than 2 nanoseconds, that's the key, less than 2 nanoseconds, it's good for EMP. If it's slower clamping than that, then it's not good. It's only good against lightning, okay? But that's one of the cheaper ways. Now, Transtector Corporation has a full line of EMP protectors for solar equipment and for individual computers and televisions and refrigerators that you can buy, plug it into the wall, and then you keep your cord from a computer or a refrigerator fairly tightly coiled so that it's not long and stretched out. If it's tightly coiled, the EMP won't react as much with that cord. But the EMP protector will keep anything from the house wiring from getting into your appliances. So it's not cheap. It is significant outlay to protect your home against EMP. It's very important, even if you're in rural area, to have some type of ham radio equipment and that it be unplugged and unattached to the antenna so that it doesn't get fried with the EMP. And you can put it in EMP-proof Mylar bags and containers that are out there on the market, but it's important to keep them unplugged until you need them because...
Let me ask you about your water pump, because that could have a long electrical line on it. What is the best way to isolate that?
Well, the water pump, unfortunately, you cannot put an EMP protector down there in the water on the water pump itself. Now, the water pump, fortunately, is just an electric motor down there, and they are fairly resistant to EMP. Most of them have a capacitor associated built in, but capacitors are capable of handling fairly large charges. And so it is important to have an EMP protector on the house to make sure that doesn't go through the panel and down to the pump. But depending on how far the well is from the house and how deep the power cable is buried in the ground depends on how much EMP it takes. But most pumps, I repeat, most pumps will survive EMP.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. And it's that kind of detailed information that you have in Secure Home that is very important. And so after making sure that you've made preparations about EMP, and as you point out, that could be pretty expensive. What do you think in terms of even in terms of time frame? You know, you're looking at these provocations that Nancy Pelosi had this week, and constant escalation in Ukraine as they're sending more and more weapons to threaten the Russian fleet in the Black Sea and that type of thing. Do you see in a shorter time frame supply chain disruptions and food disruptions that are going to affect us before some type of war? What do you see in that regard?
Well, I think supply chain disruptions will be all with us, but nothing major. I'm not predicting major famine because of the Ukraine war and those types of things. We don't even import wheat from Ukraine here. We are self-sufficient in terms of grains in the United States. So I don't expect, but there will be supply short in manufactured goods. Whenever you order parts to repair things, you got a long line of delays that happen. I'm a private pilot and working with airplane maintenance and things. We have delays up to 6 months on certain parts, and there's no reason for that. These parts are manufactured in the United States. So somebody's really intervening with these things to try to damage the economy, etc. But one thing I will notice, by the way, Biden's popularity is so low because of high inflation and high gas prices that he is somehow manipulating through connections with big oil companies to lower gas prices. Mm-hmm. They're coming down, and he's not allowing more gas and oil to be produced in the United States. He hasn't unleashed any of that. So I think there's a collusion between the Democratic administration and the big oil companies to lower prices to save the Democratic Party from this disaster that's heading into the midterms. Because there's no legitimate reason why, with the current restrictions, that gas prices should be coming down.
That's right. Yeah, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was a tiny effect, and that's stopped now, hasn't it?
And they sold a portion of it to China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, those oil reserves that were sold to China, that's like a practice the U.S. does for some reason. I don't know why, but they basically take a certain percentage of our oil reserves and they sell them to the highest bidder. And at this time around, it was China. But also conveniently, the company that bought it was the same company that was bribing Biden's son, Hunter Biden.
Quite a bit of it.
To India, which is just, the mainstream media didn't cover that, but they would have rode Biden out of on a rail if they had found that out. And
chalk it up really to a decrease in demand.
The stream's getting dithered here.
If they save as bacon on this election, you can expect that they're going to get their payback on the other side, and it's going to really go through the roof on the other side of the election, right?
This brings up a very important subject about why did the Democrats shoot themselves by putting a senile old man like Joe Biden into the presidency? And
or Lala Harris.
Oh, yeah, these two idiots. But, it's very possible. It's very possible that if war comes during this presidency, it's going to be a very unpopular war. And that
Let me try to stop and play this. Let me just go back a little bit. Starting to dither and drop frames. I don't know what's going on here.
Possible that if war comes during this presidency, it's going to be a very unpopular war. And that none of the bigwigs in the Democratic Party wanted to be in the hot seat when that war and that unpopularity descended upon the United States.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, by the way, that Hillary Clinton, after saying, I'm not going to run, I'm going to run, I'm not going to run, finally said, I'm going to run. And I've long predicted, that Hillary Clinton will run and come in as a, quote, moderate. It's easy to be a moderate when you're following Joe Biden with the most radical policies in the world. Now, she'd be faking it, of course.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that I don't expect Joe Biden to run for second term.
Well, it certainly is a train wreck that we have here, and everything that they're doing, there's absolutely no way that anybody who's watching closely what they're doing could chalk it up to incompetence. It is absolutely sabotage. No other explanation, I think, could really be brought up with this. And what we have seen now from the...
I mean, I just don't see... gas is what? It's still over $5 in a lot of places. Where I'm at, it's around $4.50, maybe a little bit lower in some areas around there. I don't see that dropping much at all by November. And there's just no way. There's no way that they could fix inflation and everything else. This has been a planned sabotage of the economy. But yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that we did get some kind of drop in gasoline prices. I mean, we were approaching where I'm at. We were approaching. It looked like it was going to go well above $5, and then all of a sudden it started coming down. So I would imagine that these oil companies are adhering to Biden's bullying that they should not be making a profit, and it seems like they're keeping prices down, but that's only for the midterms. And also, that remains to be seen what's going to happen. The last presidential election was a complete nightmare as far as the voting process. There was a lot of shady things going on. What do we expect in these midterms? What's going to happen? From what I'm hearing, a lot of these illegal migrants that have come in through the southern border are getting issued Social Security cards. It's possible they'll even allow them to vote. Who knows? In New York City, they recently voted to allow illegal immigrants to vote, and then New York State Supreme Court overturned that and deemed that unconstitutional. So there's a lot of stuff like that happening.
These lockdowns going back to 2020, it's just this snowballing effect rolling its way through the supply chain. Everybody knows all kinds of strange things that there are delays on being able to get. I'm seeing that with all types of stuff we're trying to get. We're trying to get some merchandise for the show, and but even things that I'm trying to get personally. Doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason, but it's just happening everywhere, and it's continuing to get worse as we go along because the government is continuing to keep restrictions in place, and I think they're doing everything they can to bust the supply chains.
Well, some of it's getting worse and some of it is not. In other words, because everybody involved in the supply chain is not part of this conspiracy, there are people legitimately working to undo the supply chain problems, and there's government behind the scenes trying to exacerbate it. And so there's two different forces kind of working at cross channels. So some things improve in the supply chains and some things get worse. And but believe me, there is a conspiracy to damage this economy. And I think it's related to the World Economic Forum and Great Reset. That's what they need in order to call for a solution in the form of more government controls over things like that.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
There are free market forces trying to resolve those supply chain issues.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there are some people who are trying to get along with life, and yet we continually see the government stepping in on the side of chaos. Even the stuff that you're seeing with the trucking industry, the AB5 in California, it's just another step of trying to attack the small businesses, independent ownership, and operations. The government is coming in every regard, attacking us legally while we see these other things that are rolling out with food and the rest of the stuff, trying to come after the farmers. I mean, that is just rolling out this nitrogen narrative everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always...
All right, so that was Joel Skousen on the David Knight Show. I guess this guy has been a political commentator for quite some time, but I'm not familiar with him. This is the first time that I've been hearing from him that I can remember. I'm going to move over to one last video for the stream. What I mentioned earlier, pretty bizarre. I'm trying to find the right video here. This one's 3 years old. This one's 2 years old. I'm going to do this from Anastasi in Tech. I've been following her on YouTube. Let me get the video. I'll get it loaded up.
This happens roughly once every 2 seconds.
Let's see. It's a startup in Australia. Let me see if I can get this video loaded up.
This happens.
14-minute vid. All right, so this computer chip is alive. The technology I want to talk about today is something out of this world, but also a bit controversial. There's a startup in Australia who are actually growing live human neurons and then integrating it into traditional computer chips. So a bit bizarre, but we're going to check it out.
If you're watching it from 2199, this is about how the Matrix started for us. There is a startup in Australia who are actually growing live human neurons and then integrating it in a traditional computer chips in order to advance AI. Seriously, this is the closest thing to the Matrix I've ever seen. What happens when you put a biological brain in a computer chip? Let's find out. In designing modern AI chips, we derive a lot of inspiration from humans' brain. We are trying to replicate it in silicon, to replicate it architecture and computing schemes, and finally to fill it in with mind. Cortical Labs, a startup based in Australia, is building so-called dish brain chip. They grow a group of neurons, so brain cells, in the lab, and then they incorporate it into a computer chip. And it works because both computer chips and neurons communicate with electrical pulses.
I'm not sure if you've heard about the Matrix, but the original pitch for it was that people were being used as computers by the machines. What we're doing is closer to the spirit of the Matrix than the original movie.
The major advantage of this approach is that neurons can actually think on its own. They can change its shape, grow, replicate, or even die in response to the demand of the system. At first, Cortical Labs use neurons from mouse embryos, but right now they are using only human neurons in their chip.
We did find that the cells from people had a 30% increase in learning rate compared to mouse cells.
Good news, there is no brain invasion required. Cortical Lab team grows neurons artificially, but they turn out to be the same as neurons were taken from our gray matter. How do they do it? They can morph human skin cells back into stem cells and then make them grow into actual human neurons. Now, how do neurons and tech connect? The chip is actually a metal oxide chip with a matrix of tiny microscopic electrodes, each about 17 micrometers apart. They basically grow cells in contact with this grid, so the cells develop on top of it. These electrodes are used to stimulate neurons, so to send the input and read the output when neurons fire. And then you have an interface connecting dish brain to FPGA.
Yeah, so at the moment we're using the Intan chips, which enable us to do some of the stimulations and recordings of the electrodes, and then we interface this with the FPGA.
So the FPGA is currently used to get data out in real time from the system. So what we do is that we're using some chips from Intan to essentially do a digital to analog conversion from what the neurons are doing into digital values that the computer can understand. And then we use an FPGA to clock those values, so we're reading electrodes at the correct times.
Neurons are simulated with very faint electrical signal in the range of microvolts, so very slight change in the voltage. As neurons are actually alive, you need a life supporting system for them. So basically, you need to feed them, which means any device that will use Cortical Labs technology will need refills of nutrients-rich material. Just imagine one day having an excuse like, sorry guys, I have to go home because I have to feed my computer. The company's first proof of concept is to train the human cells in a dish to play Pong.
The reason why we picked Pong was because it was a fairly arbitrary game that is easy to see. It's not that we expect the neurons to only be playing Pong. It was just that this was a game that everybody knows what it is.
These neurons are actually live in the game, where they're constantly stimulated.
Every time the bow reaches the go area, we give the neurons a reward or punishment stimulus based on whether the paddle intercepted or missed a bow. This happens roughly once every 2 seconds. So in terms of gameplay, what we do is that we feed in the state of the game, and then after a certain length of time, if the neurons don't do what we want them to do, which is in this case move the paddle to intercept the bow, then we punish them in some way. The most efficient way of punishing them is, surprisingly enough, just silence. So we essentially just cut them off completely from the game world. We just put them in a dark room if they completely misbehave and don't act the way we want them to do. And then the next time we find that
We put them in a dark room if they misbehave. That's nice. As technologies like this evolve, there's going to be a lot of legal issues. There was obviously the big tech headline, Google had an engineer that they've now fired who came out and said that he believed that Google has come close to building a sentient AI. And here with this, Cortical Labs, company based out of Australia, they're using actual physical neurons that need to be fed nutrients to survive. From a legal standpoint, when does AI get citizen status, or will they get to that point? Obviously, a lot of these companies, I don't see any company allowing the AI that they create, allowing it to have citizenship or something like that. But you are building something that is, we're getting close to what it could be seen as human. So legally, how is this going to unfold? And also, as AI accelerates, what's really, aren't all the robots, do you ever watch the Jetsons? We're supposed to have had robots by now doing all the work. We were supposed to be just sipping pina coladas at the beach while the robots do all the work. That's starting to accelerate pretty quick. AI is starting to advance pretty rapidly, and it's going to get to the point where the machines are going to be doing more and more of the work. And there's no real discussion that so much. There's a little bit of discussion, but not enough at the government level. How the hell are we, what do we do as we move forward?
there is actually an improvement in the play.
This biochip, is actually based on the Carl Friston free energy principle, which comes from neuroscience and actually explains how our life and how our brain actually works. It says that...
So I dropped the frames down to 30 frames per second. I was at 60 frames per second, and was not even sustaining 60 frames for most of the time. It just kept on dropping. Also, another thing I'm noting, once I switched to 1440p, I had to make sure that my monitor was set to 120 hertz. Otherwise, it defaults to 60 hertz. This is at least on macOS. And on macOS, you actually have to hold down the Option key and select the scaled radio button in the display settings in order to bring up more options for resolutions, and that's the only way I'm able to set the refresh rate. So I've got it at 120. Now that I'm down to 30 frames per second, I'm sustaining 30 frames per second constantly. There's no drops. But I was kind of hoping that I could stream at 60 frames. I've got it AMD 6800 XT. It's got 16 gigabytes of VRAM. You would think I'd be able to do 60 frames sustained, but it must be the goddamn encoder. I'm using 264. Now on Windows, you can use NVIDIA's encoder, and that thing is pretty fast. I'm actually going to do some tests on Windows OBS and see what I can get. See if I can get 60 frames sustained. But there's supposed to be a new encoder coming out. Begins with an ATI or ATV. I think it's called ATV. And it's supposed to be more efficient. And it should be coming out. We should be able to use it in OBS across Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. But so I'm gonna look into that. See if I can find a better encoder. It's got to be the encoder that's creating the issues more than anything else.
Any living system is working on maximizing the evidence of its own existence and minimizing the variation of free energy, which means it's trying to minimize the surprise. How to minimize the surprise? You have to make better predictions, or you have to act on the environment and make it to fit to your predictions, right? In this particular case, neurons are building the model of the world. In this case, it is the Pong game, right? And then they're adjusting this model based on the feedback they get in order to minimize the surprise.
The novel thing we showed was that neurons self-organize themselves in such a way as to avoid punishment and maximize reward. And they do this using both short-term and long-term memory.
And this compute is being powered by neurons. So it actually uses just the tiny fraction of power it would require running on a traditional computer chip. Just think about it. The human brain has 85 billion neurons, and our level of intelligence runs on only about 20 watts of power, which is enough just to light a bulb.
The energy that neurons use comes from essentially sugar water, and the majority of energy consumed by the system is from the computer we use to decode the signals. The measure of efficiency that makes sense for our system is sample efficiency. That's basically a measure of how much training an agent or algorithm needs to improve its performance, and we found that neurons are much more sample efficient than most machine learning algorithms. So the simplest way to talk about how efficient the system is just in terms of simulating a neuron. We obviously have a one-to-one mapping between a neuron and a neuron. So in terms of that, our system beats the pants off any artificial neural network. In terms of actually learning tasks, we're about between 1,000 to 1,000,000 times more efficient in terms of power consumption compared to a regular neural network when it comes to learning something like Pong. This is just back of the envelope calculations we did.
One of the key advantages of this technology that it is enabling, or it's capable of fluid intelligence, meaning that live neurons can manipulate with different types of novel information in real time. So they can organize and restructure themselves. And this is essential for applications like robotics. Robots operate in highly variable environments where they always have to model the world around and also learn to change themselves to the needs of humans, right?
A robot is certainly one application we are looking into, but any application where training data is difficult or expensive to obtain is a good fit. For example, real-time stock trading data. Another application we've recently looked at is to test the psychoactive effects of drugs on neurons developed from a specific person. So for example, if there are two possible drugs which can be prescribed to a patient, We can then test both drugs in dish brain, and whichever one has the smaller effect compared to the case where there are no drugs would be the preferable one.
It also fits to a wide range of HAI applications due to its low power, and potentially it can be scaled up to data centers technology.
There are two main ways in which we can scale the system. The first is by growing more neurons per well, essentially making the thin film of neurons thicker, going from a 2D structure to the 3D structure. Second is connecting the raw output of one dish as the raw input of another, building artificial axons between these groups of cells, similar to how there are different brain regions specializing in different tasks. The biggest bottleneck to scaling to the size of a warehouse will be contamination. Growing neurons without an immune system means that any bacteria that get in will kill the neurons on the chip. These are the same type of challenges that the cultured meat industry deals with. So once we get to that scale, we will be able to adapt best practices.
And the obvious question here, is it ethical to use live neurons, so human's brain, for compute power?
As any technology, there are different applications. So as we said, some for computing, drug testing, etc. And I guess it comes down to, as I said, intention and what we use them for and how these are supported, whether it is by legislation, policies, etc. And I guess one of the things that many people are afraid of is, are we causing harm to those entities, right?
The actual numbers of cells that we're dealing with right now, there is zero chance of them developing any sort of higher order thoughts or feelings or anything other than just what any insect would do. In terms of the number of cells that we're talking about, the systems are far too primitive for them to develop some form of intelligence where we don't notice, which is the sci-fi sort of horror that we always think about, that we leave the thing in a jar overnight and then over the weekend it develops sentience and either takes over the world or we're torturing it by accident and don't notice. But with the numbers of neurons that we're looking at, that is not going to happen.
No. And then also in terms of organization, these are just, simple cells. So for a human brain, you don't have just one cell type, you have several, and they're organized in specific ways and structures. These are very simple, very, very simple systems at this stage, yeah. But they're still very valid questions, I guess. All
right, I'm going to finish up with this video from Anastasi in tech. Anyway, she has a very unique voice, kind of could put you to sleep, but interesting video from Cortical Labs here, using physical neurons with computer chips and making them play Pong, and then placing them in a dark room if they are bad and they don't do what they're told. It's a bit disturbing, but see where this tech goes. Maybe one day we can build a true Matrix like in the movie. I'm going to go over just quick the encoding I was talking about. I was trying to remember the exact name for it. I believe it's AV1, and I'm just going to load up a Reddit article here, Reddit thread. AV1 support was released for OBS about 6 months ago. This is posted 6 months ago. Unfortunately, experimental release for AV1, and they only let you record with the AV1 encoder, but from what I'm reading and seeing, AV1 should be a pretty good option for live streaming. I have a Windows workstation that I stream from, but I mainly stream from a Hackintosh, so I'm stuck on Mac OS. And I'm using 264 on there, which, is, I should be able to do 60 frames per second with the GPU that I have, and I can't even do that. I mean, I'm also at 1440, but still, the card should be fast enough to do that. So it's got to be the encoder. It's got to be the 264 encoding. So I'm hoping that AV1 development gets up to speed more, and OBS will allow people to stream with it. Maybe there may be a way to configure OBS to use it with live streaming. I would imagine before the end of the year there should be support for OBS AV1 live streaming, and I'm hoping that it's faster than 264, because 264 is a bit pokey. As I said, NVIDIA's, I think it's NVENC, NVIDIA's encoder on Windows OBS is really good. It's really nice. It's smooth. It's fast. I'm going to definitely do some tests with that on my Windows setup at 1440p and see if I can hit 60 frames. But I'm going to end the stream. And thank everybody for hanging out. Why Not Take a Stand was in the chat. Thanks for hanging out. Max9 was in the chat hanging out. I appreciate it. I'm going to try to work on a stream tomorrow. I could order again from Amazon, but I think I'm probably just going to go to the Apple store. Shit, I might even buy a new iPhone. I've got an old iPhone XR. But I'm trying to use my old iPhones as studio cameras for my ATEM setup. So I don't know. I'm gonna go by the Apple Store. At the very least, I'm gonna get another adapter, a lightning cable to HDMI, to set up my 2 iPhones that I have that should work fine with the ATEM, and then I'm gonna try to do some experimental streams with that. I should be able to get some kind of test stream up tomorrow if all goes well. And with that, I'm going to end the stream. And if it's hot and unbearably uncomfortable for you, try to stay cool. It's still 76 degrees where I'm at, and it's 11:07 p.m. That's pretty brutal. It usually gets cool here. It usually stops, goes down sometimes even into the 50s. But usually in the low 60s is where we usually are at nighttime. So it has been nastily hot. So stay cool, drink water, be safe, and don't do anything I would do. And perhaps I will see you on the other side of this stream somewhere in time.